its humble beginnings in 12th century France to becoming one of the most popular sports in the world, tennis has come a long way. But how did we get here? Well, buckle up because we are about to find out. We'll go through the history of tennis, starting way back when people didn't even have rackets. But before we get into it, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Let's get started. The pre-racket era. Alright, let's take a trip down memory lane. You might find this hard to believe, but the first known version of tennis wasn't played by elite athletes, but by monks. And the pioneers of this sport were none other than 12th century France. You should also know that tennis players didn't always use rackets. They started out using their hands. Not too surprising if you think about it. It was a new sport, which meant that there would be a lot of improvising. Records even show that at the time, the game was called jeu de paume, meaning game of the palm. It was as straightforward as it sounds. Players basically slapped a ball back and forth, but if you've ever tried hitting a tennis ball with your bare hands, then you should know just how painful it can be. Naturally, the monks soon realized this fact, so they upgraded to leather gloves. So how exactly did we come up with the name tennis? Well, during the game, the monks would shout "tennis," meaning take, before serving the ball. Funny enough, this wasn't a written down rule, it was just something the players adopted along the way. Anyways, that's how we got the name of the sport. And in my opinion, it's way better than jeu de paume. Tennis was for the elites. The game spread like a wildfire throughout Europe, and by the 16th century, it had become a favored pastime of nobility. Francis I was obsessed with the game and went on to build courts across his kingdom. This was a major step in the game's development because if Francis hadn't done that, tennis might not be as popular as it is today. He wasn't the only king who played, though. Remember the king with 6 wives? Henry VIII also spent a lot of time with the game. If you go to Hampton Court Palace in London, you'll find a tennis court there, a court that has been in existence since the 1500s. Anyways, as the sport's popularity grew, so did its complexity. The simple palm game turned into a more sophisticated racket sport, but the first rackets that were used aren't as great as the ones you see today. By the time King Charles IX of France was around, there was even an official corporation of tennis professionals. Unfortunately, not everyone can become a professional. In the past, tennis was a fancy man's game. It was for the first-class members of the society, so it was largely confined to royals and elites. The commoners only got to watch. The English Puritans. The development of tennis wasn't a smooth ride all through. There were some setbacks at different points in time. One notable event took place some centuries ago, just as tennis was making its mark in Europe. England had to go and cause some problems for the enthusiasts over there. Puritans took over in the 17th century and decided that tennis was too sinful because, nothing says sin like hitting a ball over a net. By the age of Napoleon, many of the European royal families were attacked and tennis was abandoned. To be a tennis player in England at the time was to risk your life. Eventually, the game lost its traction in England, but continued to thrive in France, Spain, and Italy. Lawn tennis and the Wingfield Revolution. Fast forward to the 19th century and tennis was about to make a huge comeback. After everything that went down in Europe, the sport had to be revived. Major Walter Clopton Wingfield played a huge role in this. The British Army officer played tennis during his free time and thought of ways he could improve the game. At the time, there were many versions of tennis and everyone seemed to play with whatever they were comfortable with. However, the version of tennis that Major Wingfield played is the one we are most familiar with today, also known as real tennis. There was no rule against bringing in new ideas, so Wingfield considered making tennis a lawn sport. In 1873, this guy combined elements from jeu de paume, racquetball, and a couple of other games to create a boxed lawn tennis set. That's not all he did. Major Wingfield also gave the newly improved game a fancy name. Sparrowstike, which no one could pronounce, so everyone just called it lawn tennis instead. Note that the changes that Wingfield made wouldn't be final. I mean, his tennis was played on an hourglass-shaped court with much higher nets than we're used to today. To add to the confusion, serves were made past a service line, not from the baseline that they are now. But the people of Victorian England loved it, and so that was all that mattered. The birth of Wimbledon. Speaking of Victorian England, no tennis history would be complete without talking about the granddaddy of all tournaments, Wimbledon. The Wimbledon tournaments aren't child's play and they have a rich history. The first Wimbledon took place in 1877, and though there were only 22 male participants at the time, it marked the beginning of what would become one of the world's most prestigious sporting events. Women weren't allowed to participate in the tournament until 7 years later. Back then, the winner of Wimbledon was given a funny title. They were crowned All England Lawn Tennis Club Single-Handed Champion of the World, which is probably the longest and fanciest title in sports history. The prize? A silver gilt cup, and of course, bragging rights. Thankfully, if you win Wimbledon during our day and age, you can also go home with a £2.7 million cash prize. The Grand Slam. Tennis goes global. As tennis grew, so did its scope. People from different countries wanted to try it out. The US got in on the action with the creation of the US National Championships in 1881. This competition is now called the US Open. Meanwhile, France introduced the French Open in 1891, and Australia jumped on board with the Australian Open in 1905. Together with Wimbledon, these tournaments became known as the Grand Slam events, the crown jewels of tennis. Winning any of these tournaments can help you make a name for yourself. The growth tennis saw during that period was impressive, but unfortunately not everyone could attend Australia's events because of its geographic isolation. It was really tough for top players to make it there, because who wants to spend months on a boat for a tennis match? The Open era. It's hard to imagine what tennis tournaments would look like if professionals weren't allowed to play, but this was the case before the 1960s. Amateurs were allowed to play in the prestigious tournaments while professionals played exhibition matches. It was a scandalous time of shamateurism, with national associations secretly paying top players under the table. But by 1968, Wimbledon had enough of this double life and opened its doors to professionals. This was the beginning of the Open era, a period where everyone was allowed to participate in tournaments. The first major tournament of this era was held at Roland Garros, home of the French Open. Finally, tennis stars could stop pretending and start getting paid properly for their talent. The modern game. From the 1970s onward, tennis exploded in popularity, partly thanks to well-known players like Billie Jean King, Bjorn Borg, and Martina Navratilova. Even John McEnroe played his part in this. Remember him? He's the guy that always shouts at umpires. The men formed the Association of Tennis Professionals, ATP, while the first 9 women in tennis established the Women's Tennis Association, WTA, in 1973. They called themselves the Original 9, and later participated in a match against the men in the famous Battle of the Sexes that year. Want to know who won that match? Well, it was the ladies. Billie Jean King destroyed Bobby Riggs, and it was not a pretty sight to watch. As tennis evolved, so did its playing surfaces. Alongside grass and clay, hard courts became standard, making the sport more accessible globally. Technology was also upgraded, with new racket materials replacing wood and electronic line calling becoming a thing. No more relying on half-blind umpires to decide if your shot was in or not. During the modern era, tennis has witnessed some of the most remarkable talents we've seen in generations. The era has been dominated by personalities like Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic. These three have taken tennis to unimaginable heights, smashing records and each other's dreams on their way to collecting Grand Slam titles. Serena and Venus Williams have done the same on the women's side, securing their legacies as two of the greatest athletes of all time. So, there you have it, the history of tennis. Which part was your favorite? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into sports history. See you in the next one!